Tov, today's daf yomi is Sanhedrin Memo, Sanhedrin 41. Today's daf is dedicated for Shmir for the Chayalim, Matzah for the Shliim, Yeshua for Am Yisrael, and also Zecher Nishmat, David ben Yair Besara, my dear friend David Schwartz, this is his first yortzeit, killed in Gaza, Al Kiddush Hashem. Amar Ua Minayla Asram in Torah. Ua says, how do we know that biblically speaking, you're obligated to warn a person if you want to punish him? You first have to warn him. And it states, the Gemara is going to cite four possible reasons for this. First comes from the pasuk from Ramos. A man will take his Isha Sharikach Es Achoso Basaviv Basimo. A man who will take his wife, Rahman al-San, the Ra'as Ervasa, and he will see her erva. So the Gemara says, it says, you think the sin is just looking? That's not the sin. It's not a good thing. That's not where you're going to get kares. And it means you have to explain to him why it's prohibited. So, and when you'll kares, and if it's not for kares, because we know that you're not going to get, we don't need hasra, you don't need a warning for death from heaven, because Hashem knows what's in your mind. So Tanei when you malchus, so we use it to say that this is for lashes. If you that in addition to getting kares for this sin, you get lashes. For the lashes, you need a warning on top of 41a. He says, it comes from the source of the idea of murder. It says, so how do we know he kills with guile? So you warned him and he still killed intentionally. Third opinion is the Rabbi Shmuel Tana, that you found the person who was gathering the wood. So why is he gathering? Not that he had gathered, but that you warned him and he was still gathering. The Rabbi Tana is the fourth source, al dvar asher inah, because a person committed adultery with a married woman, but it says al dvar, which means al iske dibor, that you had warned him, that you had warned him first. With shricha, we need all four psukim because of Rahman Achot, which just says the first verse by Ulah, which is the verse of his sister Avimina Chayvim Malkos in Chayvim Misa Slow. I would have said that only for lashes do you need a warning, but not for a more severe penalty of death. So therefore, Kasav Rahmana Kiyazid. And so therefore the Torah tells us about death, you also need warning. Because of Rahmana Chiyazid, and if it just said the pasuk of Chiyazid, Havamina Hani Mili Sayif, I would have said, okay, by a case of Sayif, the execution by the sword, to kill, because it's a lesser penalty, there you require warning. Of Oskila, but stoning the Chamura, which is more severe, I might have thought you don't need to have the warning. And so therefore, we have the pasuk by Skila as well, by the case of Makoshesh. The Tarte ben Hiskoin, and why do we need two psukim? The Tarte ben Hiskoin, why do we need two sources by stoning? Where Rabbi Shimon, so according to Rabbi Shimon, who says that burning is more severe than stoning, and so therefore you can't learn out of Kal V'chomer from stoning. You can't learn out if you need by the more severe one, then you for sure need it by the more lesser one. So therefore, it's to tell us the extra time by stoning is to tell us you also need it by burning. And Rabbanan, according to the Rabbanan, who say that stoning is more severe than burning, and so therefore you could have warned it out from a Kal V'chomer. From stoning, we say something which you could have derived from a logical argument. The Torah will still sometimes write. Now ask the question: why doesn't the Torah just write it by stoning that you need hasra, that you need warning? And then we could have derived all the other sources from stoning. Gemara says by a logical argument. Gemara says here also Boker Tov Habs. Something that you could derive from the Kal V'chomer, the Torah sometimes will write as well. And so now we're on 41a at the first white line. So we went in the Brisa that the court asks the witnesses, did this person, the person who's the defendant, hitir atzmo misa, meaning to say, he knows that he's about to be killed. They warn him, and he says, yeah, I'm still going to do it. So Manoan, what's our source for this idea that he needs to acknowledge that he's being warned and he still does it, even though he knows he's going to be killed if he does this action? The pasuk says, Al pishnayim edim ashosha edim, you must hames. The mace, the one who will be put to death, you must, which means from the extra language, ad sheyatir atzmo misa. From the fact that it says hames, meaning to say that he already said, I know I'm going to die if I do this. Amar Rav Chanan, Ede Nara Murasa Shahuzmus, or Rav Chanan introduces an idea which the Gemara is going to challenge, and basically the rest of the Amar. So Rav Chanan says, the witnesses who testify about a woman, a young maiden who is betrothed, meaning she's not fully married, she's just betrothed, which is a marriage, but it has not yet been consummated. So in this woman, if there are witnesses who testified against her, and then these witnesses are impeached, Huzmu, and the witnesses themselves cannot be killed, even though we typically will do to the witnesses kasher zamam, like they try to do. These, in this case, they're not going to be killed. Why? Because they could always claim, well, listen, we didn't come to kill her. We just came to say she's not allowed to be with her husband anymore, because we have a concept that if a woman commits adultery, she's prohibited to her husband. From that point on, asura ba'al, asura ba'al, she's prohibited to the husband and to the man she had adultery. So they could say, listen, we weren't trying to kill her. We're just trying to say she can no longer be with her husband. Gemara says, but they warned her. And Gemara says, no, they didn't warn her. If they didn't warn her, how would they kill her? How could they possibly kill her? So the Gemara says, no, it's a woman who's a big scholar, and she knows the halacha. She doesn't need to be warned. She knows everything. Now, Liba the Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, it follows the position of Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. The Tanya Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda Omer, that Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says, listen, if he's a Torah scholar, he doesn't need to be warned. The only reason why there's asra, this concept of warning, is to make sure he's doing it intentionally. And so therefore, if he's a chaver, we don't need to give him a warning. And so too, in this case, she doesn't need a warning. And so therefore, they can't be put to death, because they could always claim, we just came to prohibit her, not to put her to death. Gemara says, well, if that's the case, since they can't be killed, since the witnesses can't be killed, well, how would she be able to be killed? It's a testimony that can't be impeached, and we have a concept. We're going to learn more about this later on, and we learn about this more in Makos. We have a concept. Any testimony that can't be impeached is not considered testimony. The Gemara says, no, that is also what we're saying here. Because they are not killed, because they could always claim, we just came to prohibit her to her husband. She also can't be killed, because it's a testimony that cannot be impeached. So if that's the case, the Gemara says, so according to Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says, you don't need to warn a woman who's a scholar. If that's the case, a scholarly woman who, how can there ever be a scholarly woman how could she ever be killed for adultery, according to Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda? And the Gemara assumes that there is such a circumstance that she can be killed. So how could you ever have that scenario? So the Gemara says, Kishazinta v'chazer v'zinta. So what happened was, she had adultery, and then she went again and had an adultery, meaning to say that the second witnesses who testify that she was a adulteress, they can't say we came to prohibit it to her husband, because she was already prohibited to her first husband. So therefore, the only reason why they were coming was to have her executed. So zinta v'chazer v'zinta. Gemara says, why? The witnesses could say, we didn't come to prohibit her on her husband, we came to prohibit her on the man she had adultery with the second time. So the Gemara says, okay, so I'll tell you the scenario. Shezinta mi boel rishon, that that what happened was she had adultery. So meaning to say she had adultery with the the first the first man who she had been with. Meaning to say she was already prohibited to him. She went again and she had another adultery with him, and so she had already prohibited him. So therefore, it's obviously the case that they're only coming to have her executed because she's already prohibited to this adulterer. Or also, alternatively, the Gemara says, or else the other possibility is that she was adulterous with one of her relatives. And so therefore, since she was adulterous with one of her relatives, obviously they're not claiming that she should be prohibited to the relative because she's already prohibited. So obviously they're coming just to have her executed. So the Gemara says, Ma'ishna nara murasa. Why is Rav Hanan saying this case by nara murasa? That they could always claim that they were coming to have her prohibited to her husband. Why can't they just, a betrothed maiden? Why do we have to give that example? Why don't we say we're talking about a married woman completely? Even a married woman should be the same logic. The Gemara says, that's true. He could have given that example. So it means to say the Chiddush is even though she had never actually been with her husband because she was just engaged, he could say, I came to have her prohibited to her husband. The witnesses can make that claim. Amar Rav Chisda, Echad Omer Basayef, and Echad Omer Harago, the Echad Omer Ba'aririn. So Rav Chisda says, if one of the witnesses said, I saw the murderer kill with a sword, and the other one says with a dagger, Hargu. That the other one says, I saw with a dagger he killed, Ein Zen Nachon. It's not the same testimony, and so therefore the defendant is not put to death. But Echad Omer Kelev Shechor and Echad Omer Kelev Levanim, Harei Zen Nachon. But if one says the defendant was wearing white clothes and the other one says they're wearing black clothes, then it is valid testimony. Again, let me repeat this. So Rav Chisda says, if one of the witnesses says it was with a sword and the other says it was with a dagger, then it's not good enough testimony to convict. But if one says it was with white clothes and the other one says it was with black clothes, then it's not considered a contradiction. And so therefore they can convict in those circumstances. So that's the Chiddush of Rav Chisda. So Meisrei, the Gemara challenges this. And what does it mean when it says in the pasuk that the testimony has to be correct? She had nachon. Echad Omer b'Sayfe harago v'Echad Omer ba'aririn harago Echad Omer kelev shchorim Echad Omer kelev levanim ein den nachon. Says specifically in the Brisa so that if one says it was with a white garment and the other one says he was wearing a black garment, it's not valid testimony to convict. So Tergim Rav Chisda, how would Rav Chisda explain that? Besuder shachan kubo, the hainu sayev aririn. He said, no, Rav Chisda would say, no, that's referring to the actual murder weapon that they killed him with the scarf. And since they're arguing over what color the murder weapon was, therefore it's necessary. Therefore, if they contradict on that, testimony is out the window. Tashma, another attempt. Echad Omer Sandil of Shechorim, Echad Omer Sandil of Levanim. In Zanachon, if one says the shoes of the defendant were white and shoes are black, it's not valid testimony, and the defendant goes free. I mean, there's a contradiction to Rav Chisda. Gemara says, no, Hasam Nami could go and Shabbat Sandalo. No, there too, the shoe was not just the clothes of the defendant, but it was the murder weapon. They're talking about where he hit him with the shoe. Tashma, again, a question on Rav Chisda. Ma'asu Badak ben Zakkai ba'uksei. It says in our Mishnah that Ben Zakkai checked from the figs, the stem of the figs. Means if they would have contradicted about the stem of the figs, then the testimony will be thrown out. So Amar Rabbi Rachama, no, to go into Akat Steina b'Shabbos. There too, it's the equivalent of the murder weapon. It's where he picked a fig on Shabbos, and that's a violation of Shabbos, and he's being put to death over the picking of the figs on Shabbos. And so therefore, that's why it's necessary to know the thickness of the stem of the figs. It's almost the equivalent of the murder weapon. Gemara says, Vatanya, but didn't we learn in the Brisa? No, it was talking about the fact that the murder happened under the fig tree. Could go into Shiftu b'yichor sheltana. No, what's going on here is that he killed him through a fig branch. He made a branch into a spear, and so therefore we need to know exactly the thickness of the stems, because it's like the murder weapon. Mar again challenges Tashma Amroan Te'ena Zo Uktsel Dakin Uktsel Gasin Te'enim Shacharos Te'enim Lavanos. He says no. They specifically asked, is this were the figs there thin or thick? Were they white or black? So he's clearly not asking about the murder weapon, but about the figs. Elam Rav Yosef Mi Ben Zakai Losiv Inish. You mean to say that you're challenging me from Ben Zakai? Shani Ben Zakai the bedikos kechachiros mashvila. Ben Zakai is different because Ben Zakai is of the position that the chakiros are like the bedikos. He argues with the author of our Mishnah. He's saying that if there's any contradiction whatsoever, it nullifies the testimony, and you need to know everything. So the Gemara says, so if there's any contradiction, it's nullified. So Ben Zakai is not arguing with our Mishnah. Rav Pista holds like our Mishnah. Who is this Ben Zakai? Mam Ben Zakai. Ilim Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai. If you want to say it's the famous Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai, Miyavi be Sanhedrin. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai wouldn't have even been in the Sanhedrin. Vatanya. Kolshno Savsha Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai may have Esrim Shana. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai lived 120 years. Arbaim Shana Sakbet Brahmatia. The first 40 years he was in business. Maybe it was he was still learning Torah, but he was in business. Mem Shana Lamad. Then the next 40 years he studied Torah, made enough money, and he was just a student. And then Arbaim Shana he made. And then the next 40 years he was teaching Torah. Vitanya Arbaim Shana Kodem Korban Abayis, Galti Sanhedrin V'Yashvela B'Chanus. And for the 40 years before the temple was destroyed, the Sanhedrin was exiled and was living in Chanus. So Amar Yitzchak Bar Avdumi Lamar Shlo Danu Dine Knasos. Those 40 years they didn't judge punitive cases. Dine Knasos Salchadaitach. Really? They didn't judge punitive cases. Ela Shlo Danu Dine Nefashos. They didn't judge capital cases. B'Tanah Mishachar Beis HaMikdash Hiskin Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai lived after the destruction of the temple, and for the 40 years before the temple, the Sanhedrin was already not doing capital cases, and Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai, the last 40 years of his life was when he was on the Sanhedrin, so he couldn't have been part of an execution. So the Gemara says, Ela Ben Zakai de Alma. It means it's a different Ben Zakai. It's not Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai. It's just a regular guy whose name was Ben Zakai. I heard one shot. I heard Rabbi Rosner saying the name of Rav Reuven Margolios. Rav Reuven Margolios was, everybody should know who he is. He was such a tremendous scholar. He died in the 20th century. When he died, they found in his apartment 1 million index cards with Divrei Torah Chidushim written on them. Anyway, they say Rabbi Ben Zakai de Alma. It was just a regular Ben Zakai. How can Nami Mistaber? It's logical to say these Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai. If you want to say it's the great Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai, Karilei Rabbi Ben Zakai, would they call him? They would have called him Rabbi Ben Zakai, not Ben Zakai. Mar says, well, Tanya, but it can't be. It is Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai. It says, Maisu Badak Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai, but Uktei Te'enim. There's an instant Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai checked the stems of the figs. Ela Talmud Ayoshev Lifnei Rabbi Hava. So at this point in his life, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai was young. When he said this chiddush, he was young. He was just a student. Amar Milso Mistabaru Taima. And he said it, and it was logical. The Kavua Bishmei, on top of Mem Aleph and Beis, they established it in his name. And Kiyav when he was studying, he was Ben Zakai Havikarway. When Ketalma Yoshev Lifnei Rabbo. When he was a student, like sitting before his teacher, they called him Ben Zakai. Kiyavi Lime, but when he's teaching Torah, Havikarway Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai. That's what he was called, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai. And Kikarway Ben Zakai. And in our Mishnah, when they call him Ben Zakai, Al Shem to me Kara. They call him back to his students when his student days. They call him Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai. That's when he is in the present, so to speak. So they memorialized in the Mishnah the chiddush he had when he was a student. We see from here that a person who's a student can come up with an idea and it'll be included in the Mishnah. You don't have to be the greatest Torah scholar, the most established sage of your generation, to have an idea that's memorialized and internalized for all of human history every time we study the Mishnah. So we had said in the Mishnah that if one person says, I don't know, by the Chakiros, by the Bedikos, if one person says by the 7 classic questions you have to ask, which is called the Chakiros, if one says, I don't know, like those are the testimonies necessary to impeach it, and one says, I don't know, the testimony is canceled. But by the Bedikos, by the lesser question, if one says, I don't know, the testimony is still valid. And then it says, even if 2 say they don't know by the Bedikos, it's going to be valid. Maya fiu shnayim omrim. What's our Mishnah saying? Even if two say it, pshita. It's obviously the case. If one says I don't know, it's valid. Also, if two say it, it's also valid because they're not contradicting each other. So the Gemara says, Amar Sheshis Areisha Kai. It refers to the first clause. And this is what it means to say. Bicha Kiros, by the 7 classic questions, even if you have 3 witnesses there, you don't need the third witness. But even if you have 2 say they know the answer, and one says I don't know, then the testimony is canceled. Come on, Rabbi Akiva, like this is the sugi of Rabbi Akiva, the Makat Shlosh Shnayim. Rabbi Akiva compares 3 to 2 because it says in the pasuk al Pishnayim made them all Pishlosh them on 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, and Rabbi Akiva says that you need to do hazam on all 3. And if one of them says I don't know, then you can't be mazamim, and so therefore the whole testimony is canceled. So therefore, this is going according to Rabbi Akiva. Even if 2 say I know and 1 say I don't know, testimony is canceled. Amar Ravavai dusing hayemes katani. But we said if 2 say I don't, if 1 says I don't know, it's the testimony is canceled, and Rabbi Akiva would say it's nullified. El Amar Rava achikamar. So Rava says afilu b'chakiros, even by these 7 classic questions, Shnaim Omrim Yadanav Echad Omar Yenodea Idusing Kayemes. Testimony is valid, and our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Akiva. Command hello to Rabbi Akiva. So Rav Kana and Rav Safra Tanu Sanhedrin Bei Rabbah. So Rav Kana and Rav Safra, they were learning Sanhedrin in the base medrash of Rabbah. Pagabahu Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama encountered them. Amralu Maya Mrisu Baba Sanhedrin Bei Rabbah. What did they say in your base medrash of Rabbah today? Amrulay, they said to him, Maya Mrinu Lebet Sanhedrin Dosa. My kashuach. So Rav Kana Rav Safra said to Rami Bar Chama, what can we learn in this Mesechus if we didn't learn with him? Meaning to say, what's difficult? My kashuach, what's difficult? So Amr, he said to them, Tani, I have a problem. Ma ben chakiros lo. It says in the Mishnah, what's the distinction between the 7 classic questions and the other questions? Chakiros, when it comes to chakiros, echad omer eini yodea idusam betela. One says, I don't know, the testimony is canceled. But Badikos, Echad Omer Eni Yodea, Afilu Shnayim Omer Mein Ani Yodim Eidos and Kayemes. But Badikos, the testimony is valid, even if 2 say I don't know. Milchta Idi v'Idi di'Araisi. Since both are biblically obligated, both the Chakiros and the Badikos, Ma'ishna Chakiros, Ma'ishna Badikos. What's the distinction between 2? Why by the Chakiros is the testimony canceled, but not by the Badikos? So Rav Kana Rav Safra said to Rami Bar Chama, Armoi Hachi Hasha. You think it's the same thing? The chakiros amar echad eini yodea idusam betela. Why is if one person says by the chakiros, what are the chakiros? What day? What year? What month? What year of the sabbatical cycle? What year of the jubilee? There, the reason why it's canceled is you can't place the witnesses anywhere, and so therefore it's impossible to impeach them. But bedikos echad amar eini yodea idusam chayemas because eidush ata yachol azima. So the reason why the testimony is still valid if he says I don't know is because you could still impeach the witnesses. In order to impeach the witnesses with Hazama, you have to say you were with us in another place. So if he doesn't know the color of the shoes, that's not relevant to impeaching him. So Rami Bar Chama said to Rav Kana Rav Safra, if this is the reason that you said Tuva Misa, you said good. And it means you have very good explanations. Because you are good and humble and you admit to us, therefore we said something good. But but if you would have wanted to be challenging to us, we wouldn't have been able to say anything. Because you came to us nicely, we were able to explain the Gemara in a powerful way, in a meaningful way. So we said in the Mishnah, if one says on the 2nd day of the month and one says on the 3rd day of the month, the testimony is valid. Ad kama, meaning to say, how far? Because we say they just didn't know that it was a full month the month before. We didn't know that they didn't know it was 30 days or 29 days. So how far do we give them this leeway? So only until they get through the majority of the month. Once they get through the majority of the month, we assume that they know at that point whether the previous month was a full month or a abbreviated month. If one says the 3rd day of the month, one says the 5th, testimony is canceled. So why? why is it canceled then? Why don't we just say one knows about 2 months in a row that became full and the other one doesn't know? Yada. So it must be that once you go through the majority of the month, then they know the status of the previous month. Not necessarily. So the Gemara says, no, it's possible that even once it goes through the majority of the month, they don't know. B'shipura yada. But the shofar that would be blasted when you make a Rosh Chodesh, that caused the person to know why they sanctified the month. Ubechad shofar amar detai. It's possible the guy missed the shofar 1 month. Betray shipura lo amar detai. But he didn't miss 2 shofars. And so therefore it's not that he would know once it's the majority of the month. He would know if he heard the shofar, and it's 1 shofar he would miss, but he wouldn't miss 2 shofars. And then tomorrow we're going to get into the sugya of Kiddush Levana tomorrow, but this is today's daf. If anybody has any questions, happy to address.